Do you know the massacre of Christians by Japanese soldiers in 1919 Korea? Here I introduce a report 102 years ago by Frank William Scofield. I want you to remember Japanese imperialism and their crime in the colonial age of Korea. Today, many Japanese people do not reflect their crime at that time. So I want to share with you this report for the progress of human rights. Frank Scofield was a missionary and a doctor in Korea at the time. You can access more sources from Columbia University Library online service. Just click it in my description link. Now this is the story. Title: The Massacre of Jeamni Suwon. Today, Jeamni belongs to Hwasong City. On Thursday, April 17th, news was brought to Seoul by a certain foreigner that a most terrible tragedy had occurred in a small village some 17 miles south of Suwon. The story was that a number of Christians had been shut up in a church, then fired upon by the soldiers, and then when all of them were either wounded or dead, the church was set on fire, in this way ensuring their complete destruction. Such a story seemed almost too terrible to be true, and being of such a serious nature, I determined to verify it by a personal visit. I made a detour of several miles over a mountain pass to avoid the police and gendarme station, which I knew was near the village, and by this means was able to reach the stricken district. Before entering the village, I questioned many people as to the reported burning of villages, but none had any accurate information, and all were very much afraid to speak about the affair. I finally met a boy who lived in the village where the massacre had occurred, but he absolutely to tell me anything. He protested his ignorance. Terrorism was bearing its fruit. The people were almost paralyzed with fear. Making a sharp turn in the road, I came suddenly into the village, and to my surprise found a number of Japanese colonial government officials, military and civil, holding an investigation. After a conversation with some of these officials, I was allowed to further look over the village and to take some photographs. From Koreans, I could get practically no information. They appeared to be dazed and stupefied, especially the woman, while the younger man pretended ignorance of any details. The village. The appearance of the village was one of absolute desolation. About 8 houses remained. The rest 31, with the church, had all been burned to the ground. All that remained were the stone jars of pickle and other eatables. These stood in perfect order among the ruins. The people were scattered about, sitting on mats or straw. Some had already improvised little shelters on the adjoining hillside, where they sat in silence, looking down in bewilderment at the remains of their happy homes. They seemed bereft of speech. They were probably trying to fathom why this terrible judgment should overtake them, and why they should suddenly become widows and their children orphans. There they sat helpless and forlorn, entirely overcome by the calamity that had overtaken them. The story of massacre. Before long, the colonial government party left the village, and when the officer was well out of sight, the tongues of some of these poor frightened people loosened, and they revealed to me the story of the outrage. The story was as follows. On Thursday, April 15, early in the afternoon, some soldiers had entered the village and given orders that all the adult male Christians and members of Cheondokyo Heavenly Way Society, the native religion, were to assemble in the church, and a lecture was to be given them. In all, some 23 men went to the church as ordered and sat down wondering what was to happen. They soon found out the nature of the plot, as the soldiers immediately surrounded the church and fired into it through the paper windows. When most of them had been either killed or wounded, the Japanese soldiers cold-bloodedly set fire to the thatch and wooden building, which readily blazed. Some tried to make their escape by rushing out, but they were immediately bayoneted or shot. 6 bodies were found outside the church, these having tried in vain to escape. 2 women whose husbands had been ordered to the church, being alarmed at the sound of firing, went to see what was happening to their husbands and tried to get through the soldiers to the church. Both were brutally murdered. One was a young woman of 19. She was bayoneted to death. The other, a woman of over 40, was shot. Both were Christians. The soldiers then set the village on the fire and left. This briefly in the story of the massacre of Cheonmi. For cold-blooded brutality, it will require a lot of beating. And long will it remain a stain on the Japanese army, and Japanese military methods in this country were made plain to the world. The blame for this cannot be placed on the shoulders of the ignorant and boorish Japanese soldiers. Officers higher up were cognizant of it, if not directly part to the plot. It is impossible that the strict discipline which prevails in the Japanese army would of any private soldier or surgeon taking such a responsibility upon his shoulders. Some of the foreigners who were at the village the day after burning and photographed one of the dead-burnt bodies said that the smell of burning human flesh was frightful. Taking all that above into consideration, there is no wonder that all the people were paralyzed with fear. The story was told me by several of the villagers. All their stories were substantially the same. The poor people begged me to give them protection. They informed me that they were living in constant dread of further atrocities. They did not know when they were likely to have other visits from the police and soldiery, and that the next time they might be exterminated. One young widow who had previously passed through a mission school came up and took hold of my hands and told me in tears how her husband had been killed. She was followed by woman after woman, all anxious to relieve themselves by telling me their trouble. Nearly all of them wondered when the missionaries would come again. Yet they all seemed afraid if they did come, it would make matters worse. Their condition was pitiful. My presence, however, seems to have broken to a certain extent the spell that had been cast over them. They began to realize more clearly what had befallen them. And as they did so, the sound of the wailing of the widows and orphans could be heard across the little valley. I left them after trying to comfort them and returned in the evening. As soon as I arrived, a youth came up to me. He had escaped, but he told me that both his father and mother had been murdered. His mother, he said, had become alarmed at the firing and had gone to the church to try and ascertain if she could not render her husband assistance. She was killed as stated above. Heart-rending sights were to be seen on every hand. In one place was a little mite of a girl preparing the evening meal of harvest for her mother, who was prostrated by grief. She was making it in a broken earthenware vessel placed on some stones with a lighted straw underneath. I left the little orphan baby wrapped up in a rags on mat of straw. What villagers said. I tried to find out from the villagers if they knew of any particular reason why they should be singled out for such cruel treatment. They told me that they had not shouted for independence in the village, but on the market day with many others, they had like all Koreans shouted for liberty. They knew of no reason why they had been so punished, unless it was because there were many Christians living there. Some thought that it was because a gendarme had been killed and gendarmerie station burned down. But they had not committed this act, it having happened many miles away. Otherwise, they could give no reasonable explanation for the action of the Japanese soldiers. What the Japanese policeman said. In this, I must be careful as the policeman was Japanese and his statements had to be interpreted. He said the fire was the result of Korean carelessness. That is, it started in one of the houses and spread. As to the shooting of the men and women, he said that they were very bad people in that village and that they refused to be arrested, they had to be shot. This was the gist of his statement. It is impossible to give any reason for so dastardly a crime. The soldiers and police alone know the reason for their bloody act. I was informed that a very high official casually remarked that a gendarme had been killed. This, in his opinion, apparently was sufficient reason for such an act to be committed. It should be noted that the gendarme was only killed after had shot a crowd of defenseless Koreans, some of whom he killed and wounded. Personally, I am of the opinion that two things influenced those responsible for this crime. First, the killing of the gendarme in the village some distance away. Second, the intense hatred of the Christians. If you want more story, you can access more sources from Columbia University Library online service. Just click in my description link. Thank you.